Today's daf we're going to be learning as Avodah Zarah Daf Zion. Today's daf is sponsored by Sylvia Klein in loving memory of her brother Bobby Klein, who passed away 40 years ago. He taught us about love and acceptance. His humor, friendliness, and loving spirit is greatly missed. Okay, we're going to get started with where we ended yesterday. We had a story where Rabbi Yosef sat behind Rabbi Abba sat behind Rav Huna, and Rav Huna explained that he paskin like Rabbi Yeshua ben Korcha, which was this third approach that we didn't see in our Mishnah, that distinguished between a loan with promissory note and a loan that was done orally. And a loan done orally, you can collect from a Gentile because you cannot collect from a Gentile because that is just tsar hulo, because he wasn't really expecting to necessarily have to pay it back. Whereas the promissory note, if you collect it from a Gentile, it's actually going to create happiness for the Gentile, because the Gentile is going to be very happy they got rid of this burden knowing that you had a promissory note and you were going to collect it. So Rav Huna said we paskin like Rabbi Yeshua ben Korcha, and also said we paskin like Rabbi Yehuda. So first we're going to have to understand what issue did he paskin like Rabbi Yehuda? Did Tanya, okay? Ki Rabbi Yehuda did Tanya. I'm on the last line of Vav Amud Bet. It's a Mishnah. It says Tanya, it should be Ditnan. It's a Mishnah in Bava Kama, which also is quoted in Bava Metzia. It's a Mishnah in Bava Kama, Hanoten Semer Latzava. Litzbo lo adom utzvo shachor, shachor utzvo adom. We learned this a whole bunch of times. You give cloth, wool to a dyer to dye it red, and the dyer dyed it black. Or black, you wanted it black, and they dyed it red. Rabbi Meir Omer. So now you gave it to someone, and they did the wrong thing with it. Now what happens? Did they return you the value of your wool, or did they return you the wool that's dyed and somehow compensate for you for the fact that they did it incorrectly? So what's the deal? We have a machlok at Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda about this in the Mishnah in Bava Kama. Rabbi Meir Omer, notelo demeit samro. Rabbi Meir says, and the way Rashi explains this, both in Bava Kama and here, is that anyone who changes from what you ask them to do is actually like a thief. And that's why it's in Bava Kama and the laws of theft. And when you steal something, you actually acquire it, okay? Especially if you change it, it becomes yours, and you have to return it at the value it was at the time. So that's what Rabbi Meir says, no tailors made some low. You get back the value of the wool. Okay, so basically the person who dyed it is like they stole it. They keep the dyed wool and they return you the value of what they took from you. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Rabbi Yehuda disagrees and says, we don't view you as a thief. But there's a principle we're going to see that comes up in a Mishnah in Bava Metzia, Kol HaMeshaneh Yado Tachtona. Anyone who changes from what they were told to do, like in this case, the dyer changed the request and dyed it the wrong color, Yado Tachtona. So that means they have the upper hand, they have the underhand, okay? Exactly, right? They are in a weaker position. So what does that mean? Well, Rabbi Yehuda Omer, what it means is they're not considered a thief. So they don't acquire the object. So they obviously have to return the wool, but now the wool is dyed. And it's actually worth more because it's dyed. The problem is it's not really what the person wanted. So how do we evaluate what the person has to pay? Well, ima shevach yeter al yitzia, noten lo et yitzia. If it went up in value, let's say it was worth 100 to begin with, it went up in value to 150, and the amount that you invested in it was 20, that the dyer invested in it was 20. So the dyer gets back, if the amount it went up was by 50 and the amount invested in it was 20, then noten lo et yitzia. He just has to pay the amount of the expenses, the 20. Ima yitzia yitera l'shevach. But if they invested 20 and it only went up 10, then noten lo et hashevach. Then the person who owned the wool only has to pay 10 and not the 20 of the what was invested. Okay, so the person who dyed the wool incorrectly would lose out. So in that case, let's go back. Rav Huna basically says in front of Rabbi Abba and Rabbi Yosef that we paskin like Rabbi Yehuda in that case. The reaction of Rav Yosef was, Hadrinu Rav Yosef Lape, he turns his head around, okay? Some people explain he turned his head around in anger. Okay, he was very upset about this. Okay, why was he upset? Interesting, he got so upset for this kind of issue. I understand why you said the halacha is Rabbi Yeshua ben Korcha. We need you to tell us that. We wouldn't have known it had you not told us. Right? Salkadat Tachamina. And why would we have not thought we hold like Rabbi Yeshua ben Korcha? Because you would have thought normally we hold like Tanakama, because Tanakama usually represents the mainstream opinion, which is the majority. We usually go by the majority. So we would have thought Yachiv Rabim, Halacha Karabim. When you have an individual, which is Rabbi Yeshua ben Korcha, and you have the majority opinion, which is the Tanakama, Halacha Karabim. We go by the majority opinion. Kamash Malan Halacha Kiyachid. So you needed to teach us, in this case, we go like Rabbi Yeshua ben Korcha. However, Ela halacha ki Rabbi Yehuda lamali. Why did you need to tell us the halachas of Rabbi Yehuda? We already know the halachas like Rabbi Yehuda. How do we know that? Well, pshita, it's obvious, because there's a principle. When we paskin halacha, there's certain principles. One of the principles is machloket v'achar kach stam, halacha kestam. If something appears in a Mishnah as a machloket, and after that, it appears as a stam Mishnah, meaning it's a Mishnah that's not with any name, and there's no machloket about it. Machloket, and then halacha kestam, then we paskin like the stam opinion in the Mishnah. So in our case, we have a machloket b'Bava Kama, that's what we quoted before, and stam b'Bava Metzia. And in Bava Metzia, there's a stam Mishnah, as I mentioned, that holds like Rabbi Yehuda. So it's a case of machloket. Afterwards, because Bava Metzia comes after Bava Kama, there's a stam. Ditznan, kol mishaneh yado ala tachtona, v'chol hachazer bo yado ala tachtona. This is what I quoted to you before. If you change from what the request was, you're an uman, right, a craftswoman, you do what the person asked, but you change from what they ask, and you don't do it in the same way they asked, then you're at the underhand, you have the weaker position. And likewise, and this isn't connected to our topic, but kol chozer bo yado ala tachtona, and that's why it appears in that parak in Bava Metzia of hasocher to umnim, which is if you hire people and they renege on you, then again they have the weaker position. So, right, the one who changed, right, they reneged on their agreement, so they're in the weaker position. Now, here you have, so in this case, there's no point for Rav Huna to tell us the halachas of Rabbi Yehuda. It's obvious because it's a case of machloket in Bava Kama. After that, it appears as a stam Mishnah. Therefore, we would know that we go by the stam Mishnah, which is Rabbi Yehuda's position. For Rav Huna, so what did Rav Huna explain? Well, Rav Huna mishum de ein seder la Mishnah. Dika lameimar stam tana bereisha va'achar kach machloket. There's no real order to the Mishnah. So Rav Huna could say that you might have thought that the stam comes first and after that is the machloket, because we don't view the order as important. Okay, like the order, the way it is, isn't relevant. So the Gemara says, well, that makes no sense in light of that halachic principle. Every time that we have a principle that's based on the order. So how can you say there's no order? And the order is not important. Okay, it's like saying Mukdam Muchar B'Torah, right? Well, if you say Mukdam Muchar B'Torah, then you can't at the same time say, right, which means there's no order in the Torah, then you can't at the same time say if something appears first and then something else appears after, there's significance to the order. So that doesn't make any sense. So they're going to fine-tune what we said about Rav Huna. Rav Huna ki lo amrinan ein seder b'chad masechta. We just said that Rav Huna must hold that there's no significance to the order. But now we're going to say, and it's a bit of a double negative, we don't say there's no order, meaning we do say there's order, because it's a double negative, in one Masechet. If you have within the same Masechet, right, we're in two different Masechtot, Bava Kama, Bava Metzia. If you're in the same Masechet, you can't say there's no significance to the order. Then if you have a Machloket and then a Stam Mishnah, we're going to always pass about the Stam Mishnah. But in two Masechtot, we say there's no significance to the order. So therefore, since the Machloket was a Bava Kama and the Stam Mishnah was Bava Metzia, we don't view that as a Machloket v'achar kach stam. Machloket v'achar kach stam, according to Rabbi Huna, and maybe even everyone we're going to see, is only within the same Masechet. So then why is it so obvious to Rav Yosef? Well, Rav Yosef, and you may have already thought about this, because we talked about this a lot, we learned the Bavas, Kul and Ezekin Chad Masechti. All of the three Bavas are like one long Masechet. And therefore, even though Machloket v'achar kach stam doesn't work within two Masechtot, within Bava Kama, Bava Metzia, it does. The order is significant because they really used to be all one Masechet and then were divided up. And it's viewed as one entire Masechet. So therefore, that's how we explain the Machloket between Rav Huna and Rav Yosef. Do we view this as one Masechet or not? Because if it's not the same Masechet, then this ruling doesn't apply because the order is not significant between Masechtot. But within one Masechet, it would have been, but that's not what we have here. Rav Yosef said, this is what we have here because all of the Nezikin is one Masechet. Or we could have a different explanation for Rav Yosef. Maybe he does think these are two different Masechtot. However, Ibait Emi has a different reason to say it's obvious we hold like Rabbi Yehuda here, not because Machloket v'achar kach stam, but mishum dekatani lakabe hilchata psikta. Kol mishanei yado l'tachtona v'chol chozer bo yado l'tachtona. There's certain halachot that are what we call halachot psukot. They're clear and there's no machloket about them. And it could be that Rav Yosef had this on his list, the Mishnah in Bava Metzia, anyone who changes Yadola Tachtona is in a weaker position, and anyone who reneges on agreement, they're in a weaker position. Could be that Rav Yosef had that in his list of halachot psukot that there's no disagreement about. Now, obviously, there was a disagreement at some point, but it could be at a later point there was no longer a disagreement about this, and therefore he held it was just so clear and obvious that we hold like Rabbi Yehuda that there was no need to say it. Okay, so that was all just an aside to explain this position of Rabbi Yehuda, that when Rav Huna came and said, we hold like Rabbi Yeshua ben Korcha, we hold like Rabbi Yehuda, what Rabbi Yehuda was he talking about? Now, since we mentioned this Rabbi Yeshua ben Korcha, we're now going to have a slew of halachot where Rabbi Yeshua ben Korcha disagrees with someone about an issue, and we hold like Rabbi Yeshua ben Korcha. Tanu Rabbanan. So we're going to jump from topic to topic, both in this part of the Gemara and in the later part of the Gemara, which is actually on the next Mishnah already. We're going to be jumping from topic to topic. Tana, and really the discussion in both cases, later it's going to be not Rabbi Yeshua ben Korcha, it's going to be some other rabbi, Nechum Amadi. It's going to be kind of who do we hold like in certain situations and debates. Tanu Rabbanan, lo yomar adam lechaviro hanir'eh she'ta'amodi mila'erev. You can't say to your friend on Shabbat. On Shabbat, there's an issue that you can't talk about doing malacha on Shabbat. So you can't talk about hiring someone on Shabbat. You shouldn't start doing business dealings with people. Oh, I want to hire you. But can you say the following? It seems like you should come with me this evening. When you really mean is come with me and do a job for me. So according to Tanakama, you can't say that. But Rabbi Yeshua ben Korcha omer adam lechaviro hanir'eh she'ta'amodi mila'erev, because you're not actually mentioning malacha. You're alluding to it, and maybe it's clear what you're referring to, but you're not actually saying anything. Since it comes from daber daval, it has to be, which is a pasuk in Yeshayahu, it has to be that you actually express something in words that is forbidden, and you did it. You just made reference to something, and obviously everyone was thinking of it. That's your hurim. That's not speech. That's thoughts. This time we have Rabba Bar Chana saying in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, we paskin like Rabbi Yeshua ben Korcha. Tanu Rabbanan, next case. Hanish'al l'chacham v'timei. Lo yish'al l'chacham v'yitahel. If you ask a halachic question and they said this following item, you're not sure if it's impure or pure, they say it's impure, you can't go ask another rabbi and get another opinion to say it's not, it's pure. Or l'chacham v'asar, or you go to a chacham and he forbids something. Lo yisha'el l'chacham v'yatir. Don't go to a different chacham who's going to say, oh yeah, no, this is permitted. Hayu shnayim. But if there were two in front of you when you ask the question, echad tameh, echad matahil. One says it's impure, one says it's pure. Or echad oser, echad matir. One forbids, one permits. Im haya echad mehem gadol mechavero b'chochma v'minyan. If one was a more prominent, more wise rabbi, then halacha charav, then you go by that one, whether it's l'chumra or l'kula, it doesn't matter. V'im lav, but if they were both on equal standing, halacha charav machmir, we're going to be stringent. Comes Rabbi Yeshua ben Korcha disagrees. Rabbi Yeshua ben Korcha omer b'shel Torah, halacha charav machmir, b'shel sofrim halacha charav mekel. Now, let's go with the fact that he's talking about the very last thing that was said, that if they're both of equal stature, you go the stricter way. Comes Rabbi Yeshua ben Korcha and says we're only going to be strict if it's on a Torah level. If it's a rabbinic issue, then we're going to be a little more lenient. And that's based on a principle in general. If you have a doubt about a Torah law, we're stringent. If you have a doubt about a rabbinic law, we're going to be lenient. Some people think that he actually disagrees with the entire thing and thinks that if two, right, meaning that also the part about gadol mechavero b'chochma v'minyan, that even if the other person was gadol b'chochma v'minyan, you still go l'chumra if it's Torah and l'kula if it's rabbinic. There's a debate among the commentators whether he disagrees about that or disagrees about only the very last part if they're both of equal stature. Okay? And Amar Rav Yosef, Hilchita Rabbi Yeshua ben Korcha. In this case, it's Rav Yosef who paskins like Rabbi Yeshua ben Korcha. Tano Rabbanan. Next issue. Here is a bit of a debate what exactly the case is, but we're going to go with Rashi here. Rashi explains that we're talking about either a thief who's not allowed to testify, or we're talking about an Amaretz who we don't trust when it comes to things like tithes and, you know, all sorts of issues that Amaretz weren't trusted about. וכולן שחזרו בהם, הם מקבלים אותם עולמית, דברי רבי מאיר. If they did tshuva, okay, the Amaretz decided to be more like a chaver and keep them those mitzvot, or a gazlan who decided to do tshuva and repented, we can't accept them ever. Okay, so the Amaretz will never be considered chaver. The gazlan will never be the thief. It will never be permitted to testify in court. Now, this is interesting because it seems to contradict a sugya in Sanhedrin, and perhaps that's why some people disagree. There's another reason why people disagree because there's sugyas about a Aretz that they can accept upon themselves to be like chaverim. So it seems pretty clear they can. And about the thieves, there's a whole list in Sanhedrin about when we accept people to be testify. Like if someone's a gambler, so they have to break all their gambling boards and they can't even gamble for free, okay, without making money. Or there's certain things if you loan with interest. So if you stop loaning, even not on interest, okay, you have to. There's certain criteria, and in the stories, it's a whole interesting sugya there that we learned in the third parak of Sanhedrin. I believe it's on Kafchet, if I remember correctly. Very interesting sugya. This doesn't seem to go along with that. So it could be that those are the reasons why some of the commentaries don't agree with Rashi, but we're going to go with Rashi anyway. And then you could just say maybe there's different opinions there that we didn't mention at the time. So Rabbi Meir says we never accept them because we never really know if they did tshuva. Rabbi Yehuda gives a certain criteria that we can figure it out. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, if they did tshuva privately, we don't accept it because they just say they did tshuva. You know, they could easily revert back, and there's nothing stopping them. But before Hesia, if they did it publicly and they made a public declaration that they're doing tshuva, they're not going to go back to their ways because they did it publicly. Once you say something publicly, okay, it's something I think Zitzi talked about in the Siyum for Shavuot, about why do people take oaths, and particularly if they do it in public, right? It's to make them stand by their word. There's certain things we do to make sure we stand by our words. So one of them is saying something out in public. Mikablim otan, okay, so we accept it then. Then we can accept them back and assume that their tshuva was genuine. Ika da Amre, some people have a different version of this Rabbi Yehuda. Asu divrehem b'matmoniyot mikablim otam. It's not about how they did their tshuva in secret or in public. It's how they did their action. If their sin was done in private, then we can accept them back because a private sin is not as severe. So we can accept it. Depends on the severity of their sin. Turning out Amabet, but for Hesia, if they did it in public, we don't accept them because that is a much more grave sin to do something more publicly, and then we don't accept their repentance. But here comes, we were looking for Rabbi Yeshua ben Korcha. Rabbi Shimon Rabbi Yeshua ben Korcha אומרים בין כך ובין כך מקבלים שנאמר שובו בנים שובבים. Either which way we accept their repentance, because the psukim, right, there's very famous psukim in Yirmiyahu, says shuvu banim shovavim, come back. God always accepts repentance. If God can accept repentance, then we can as well. It's interesting because those are two very different things, because God knows what people are thinking, but humans never really know what other humans are thinking, and someone might look like they did tshuva, and we don't really know, and that's really why this sugya is a very interesting sugya. When we learned it in Sanhedrin, we talked about that. It's very hard to know if someone really did sincere tshuva. But and it's a different level between person and God and between other humans because we don't know what's really going on. However, Rabbi Shua ben Korcha employs that comparison, as does Rabbi Shimon, and Amar Rabbi Yitzchak Ish Parako, Amar Rabbi Yochanan Hilchatako Toazug. We paskin like that pair, meaning we paskin like Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Shua ben Korcha, and we accept them no matter what if they did tshuva. New mission. So that was, again, what did we do? Let's just review this part of the daf. We'll do our review now, which is we started with this psika. Rav Huna said we hold like Rabbi Shimon Korch, who brought this third opinion that wasn't mentioned in our Mishnah. He also held like Rabbi Yehuda. We had to figure out which Rabbi Yehuda. We showed the one about the dyer making a mistake in dyeing something the wrong color, and then we went to a whole bunch of different cases where Rabbi Shimon Korch disagrees with others, and we pass like Rabbi Shimon Korch. Now we're going to the next Mishnah. It's a Mishnah we actually quoted previously. Rabbi Yishmael Omer, Shlosha lefnehem v'shlosha la'achariyan asur. So our first Mishnah said 3 days before the holiday, you can't do business dealings with them. Comes Rabbi Yishmael and says, not only 3 before, also 3 after. V'chachamim omrim, The rabbis say, Lifnei dehem asur, lachari dehem mutar. Before their holiday, it's forbidden, but after their holiday, it's permitted. It seems like the rabbis are just saying we don't hold like Rabbi Yishmael. But already from the previous Mishnah, we heard they don't hold like Rabbi Yishmael because they only said before, they never said after. So what's the difference between Tanakama and Chachamim? We're going to have to figure that out. It's going to be something the Gemara is going to deal with. First, we have one small aside about Rabbi Yishmael, and we already quoted this in the Gemara previously. Amar of Tachlifa bar Avdimi Amar Shmuel, Yom Rishon or Yom Notzrim, depending on the version you have, right? The day, Sundays of the Christians, and basically meaning the entire week of the Christians. L'divrei Rabbi Yishmael lo olam asur. According to Rabbi Yishmael, you would never be able to do business dealings with them any day of the week because Sunday's their holiday, 3 days before, 3 days after, all are forbidden. The Chachamim omrim. Now we go back to this problem I mentioned about the rabbis. Lifnei dehem asur, lachari dehem mutar. Before is forbidden, after is permitted. Chachamim hainu Tanakama. Chachamim are saying the exact same thing that the Tanakama said in the first Mishnah. 3 days before, well, they don't mention the word 3, but we assume, okay, because they're just disagreeing and saying before, yes, not after, okay, and Rabbi Yishmael was talking about 3. So the rabbis sound like Tanakama. So what's the difference? The Gemara is now going to create 4 possible things that they could be disagreeing about. The Gemara does this a lot when they have 2 opinions that seem exactly the same. The Gemara, I'd say, sort of makes up, okay, they come up with, not a, pulling something out of the blue, but taking issues that they could be arguing about and claiming that that must be the disagreement, even though it's almost impossible to find that in the words here, okay? Because the words are 3 days before you can't do business with them in the first Mishnah. The rabbis say before is forbidden, after is permitted. And we're going to come up with 4 creative possibilities as to what they're actually debating. So the first is, an issue we already saw. We're going to go back to a few issues we already saw, which is, maybe their disagreement is, are the holidays included in the 3 days or not included? Now, we already said the first Mishnah, before the holiday 3 days. So that must mean the holiday is not included in the 3 days. So Tanakama Savar Haim Below Dehen, 3 days without counting the days of the holiday. V'Rabbanan Batrai Sabre Haim Ve'edehen. And again, we're taking something we know that there was a bit of a bit of an issue. Maybe it could be it's this, it could be it's that. We weren't sure. We figured out in the end based on the language of the Mishnah. The first Mishnah must be meaning without the holiday included. But perhaps when the rabbis come and offer some additional opinion here, which seems to be saying the same as Tanakama, maybe they differ on that one point. Maybe they think that the days before that we're talking about include, it's 3 days, but including the day of the holiday, which means 2 days before the holiday, plus the holiday. Ibai Dema, second option. Right, so again, Rabbanan Batrai is the later rabbis meeting in our Mishnah, Savrehem Ve'edehen, hold them and including the holidays. Ibai Dema, second possibility, and this is another debate we saw before. We saw it actually a debate among Amoraim, among Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish. We said they debated, what if you did work anyway? You weren't supposed to do business dealings with them and you did do business dealings with them. What happens? Are you permitted to benefit or forbidden to benefit? Maybe that's the machlokah between them. Nasav and Natan ikabenayu, if you did it anyway. Tanakama savar nasav and Natan mutal. V'Rabbanan Batrai savar nasav and Natan asur. So the Tanakama holds doing business dealings with them. Actually, it would be permitted if you did it anyway. You shouldn't do it. You did it anyway, it's permitted. And the later rabbis say, no, it would be forbidden. Now, the default is going to say that the later rabbis that come are adding on some additional prohibition. Not if we have no choice, like in the first one, since we knew for sure the Tanakama held 3 days plus the holiday, the only disagreement was actually going to be more lenient, the rabbis. But if all things are equal, and we're just saying maybe there's a debate, even though it doesn't say so here, so we're going to assume that the later rabbis are coming to forbid something that was already permitted by the first one. So the first ones think it's permitted to benefit from, the later rabbis, the ones in our Mishnah, are coming to say, no, even that is forbidden. Okay, if you did it anyway, you're not allowed to benefit. Ibai Dame, a third possibility. Shmuel ikabenayu, and this is something that's going to appear in the Gemara later. Damar Shmuel bagola ein asur ele yomedam. In the Gola, which is in Bavel, and Rashi quotes to us this Gemara in Chulin that says that Ovdei Kochavim shebachutz laaretz lav Ovdei avodah zara ninu. The Gentiles that they were in touch with in Babylonia were not idol worshippers. So because they weren't idol worshippers, they were much more lenient on their holidays. So therefore, because it wasn't any more avodah zara, they still kept it, but they minimized it to just 1 day. Okay, so in outside of Israel, really meaning in Babylonia, there's only the day of the holiday. So Tanakama eat Lady Shmuel. So again, we're going to go with Tanakama's the more lenient. They say the 3 days before that's forbidden, we're going to say now, is only in Israel, but outside of Israel, like Babylonia, it's permitted. And Rabbanan Batrai, and the ones in our Mishnah who say before is usher, after is permitted, is going to say before is forbidden, even in outside of Israel. Okay, because they don't hold by Shmuel. A fourth possibility, and this is going to take us off on our tangent that's going to go into tomorrow's daf, which is Dinachum Hamadi Ikabenayu. They have a debate about whether they agree with something Nachum Hamadi said. Ditanya, as it says in a Braita, Nachum Hamadi Omil, Eino Asur Ela Yom Echad Lifnei Dehem. Okay, notice in our Mishnah it never said 3 days according to the rabbis. It just said before is forbidden, after is permitted. So they say, maybe, now in this case, the only way to say it is that the rabbis of this Mishnah are actually being more lenient. Okay, so option 1 and option 4 had them being more lenient. Option 2 and 3 had them being more stringent. Now, why is this? Because since this in the first Mishnah is obviously mention of 3 days. In this Mishnah, there's no numbers mentioned. So perhaps they only think 1 day before, like Nachum Hamadi. So again, Tanakama late in Nachum Hamadi. Tanakama doesn't hold like Nachum Hamadi, who says there's only 1 day before the holiday that's forbidden. And Rabbanan Batrai Itlu de Nachum Hamadi, and the rabbis of our Mishnah hold like Nachum Hamadi, only 1 day before is forbidden. Gufa. Now we're going to go into Nachum Hamadi. So that was 4 possibilities to understanding what could be the debate between the rabbis of this Mishnah and Tanakama of the previous. Nachum Hamadi Omer, Eino Asur Ela Yom Echad Lifnei Dehen. So that we already heard, right? We're going now in depth into the situation. Amrulo, right? It's only 1 day. They said to him, the rabbis, Nishtaka davar v'lo ne'emal. Bury this and don't ever say it. In other words, don't teach this to anybody. We don't hold by this. So the Gemara asks, Va'ika Rabbanan Batrai, the Kaima Kavatei. What do you mean? But the rabbis in this Mishnah just said that. And that's according to interpretation number 4. We think the rabbis in the Mishnah could be saying like Nachum Hamadi. To which they answer, oh yeah, don't read it as Man Chachamim. Who are the Chachamim mentioned here? Nachum Hamadihu. It's actually one individual. Even though it said the rabbis say, it's actually Nachum Hamadi's position. And it's just one person, and we can say we don't hold that way. Tanya Idach. Now we're going to bring a slew of other, just like we did before with Rabbi Yeshua ben Korcha, and showed all these cases where we hold like him. We're going to have a slew of statements of Nachum Hamadi, and in each case, the rabbis are going to say, let it be buried and nobody listen to him. Okay? Nobody teach what he said. So the next topic, again, we're going to jump topic to topic, is that your animal is not allowed to do work on Shabbat either. Besides, right, we say this in Kiddush, right, right, and basically you're not allowed to do work, not you, not your family, right, your bincha, bitcha, abdecha, amatcha, v'behemtecha asher b'sharecha. Okay, your animals that are with you. They're not only animals that are with you, but animals that you loan to Gentiles are also a problem. If your animal is being loaned out to a Gentile, it's a problem. So you're not allowed to loan your animals to Gentiles unless they come to do work. And we're only talking about behemot kasot, animals that work, like oxen that pull the plowshare and things like that. Okay, big animals that they use for working, not small animals that generally didn't do work. So Nachum Hamadi says, and not only that, but there's a gzera not even to sell them animals, because if you sell them animals, you might come to lend them animals. If you lend them, it's a problem because it's still your animal, and people see your animal doing work on Shabbat. If you sell them, it's no longer your animal, so you're not commanded. On the other hand, you might come to actually loan them. So Nachum Hamadi says, if it's a time of war, you can sell them male horses that are old, because male horses that are old, they don't really want them for purposes of war. They don't really do very much. They can't really use them in war, right? They use horses for war, for battle. They can't really use those for battle, in which case, if it's a time of war, they're very unlikely people are going to be buying them, which creates a situation where it's a milta de lo shchicha. It's a very uncommon occurrence. Because it's so uncommon, the rabbis don't make zerot in uncommon situations. So, since this whole thing of selling animals is just a gzerah that you might come to lend them or rent them to Gentiles, therefore they didn't make the gzerah in a very uncommon circumstance, which is an old male horse during time of war. Amrulo, they said to him, Nishtaka davar v'lo ne'emal, bury that and don't let it be said. Va'ika ben Betera the kai kavate, but wait, ben Betera holds like him, because Ditnan, it says in the Mishnah, ben Betera matir besus. He permits in general horses. Because why? He says that horses are only rabbinic in nature, meaning the prohibition to ride. What do you do with horses? You ride on them. The prohibition to ride on a horse is specifically for um, for the prohibition. What people do on horses, they don't plow with them. Okay, that's real work. But they ride on them. Now, riding is only permitted by rabbinic law. It's not permitted by Torah law because Rashi explains, "Chayno seyet atzmo." It's carrying you from place to place. Now, you could theoretically carry yourself. So it's only forbidden by Torah, by rabbinic law, not by Torah law, and therefore all horses. We're not going to make a gzera on a rabbinic law, and therefore all horses are permitted to sell. So doesn't he agree? In other words, basically, the fact that Nechum Madi says you can sell the male old horse in time of war sounds like he's holding like Ben Betera. So why are we saying shut him up and don't teach what he says if he holds like Ben Betera? He's not the only one who says that. So no, he doesn't really hold like Ben Betera. Ben Betera lo maflig ben zcharin lenekevot. Yumit kamaflig ben zcharin lenekevot kirabanan sfira le ulirabanan shka davar velo ne'emal. Ben Betera thinks horses are okay in general. But the rabbis don't think horses are okay. And why is that? Because horses could have been used to trample people in war. And therefore, horses are included in the prohibition. There are things that are Torah law forbidden about them. And therefore, because they really could work, and that would be work, and therefore, the rabbis were going to assume that when Nahum Hammadi permits the male elderly horse in a time of war, that's only because of the particularly unique circumstances in a time of war. Those horses are really useless, okay? And therefore, it's very uncommon. But in general, horses would be an issue, right, according to Nahum Hammadi. It's only the male old ones that are okay. So, and in a time of war. So therefore, it seems like they do agree with the rabbis that horses in general are forbidden. He only permits a particular type, and then he doesn't hold like Ben Betera, right? He holds like the rabbis, and the rabbis disagree with him about that. Because again, the rabbis thought that even the old ones could be used to, right, one second, right. Right. So the rabbis, he held like the rabbis who forbade horses in general because they could trample people and that could be used. Okay, but then he just says not the old ones, and they said across the board, just all horses are forbidden. Tanya, next case of Nahum Hammadi. Nahum Hammadi Omer, Hashevet, which is a type of it's a type of spice that grows, okay, or some type of growth like a vegetable that grows, and it has three parts to it. It has first the leaf grows, that's going to be called the yarak, okay, which is usually the vegetable, but it means the leaf grows. Then the zirin, which are the branches of it, and then the zera, then a seed grows from it. Okay, these are things that we plant often for the seeds. So now the question is, when is it considered Gemar Malacha? When is it complete? And when it's considered complete, that's when it's obligated to be tithed. So there's a machloket here about when you tithe it. So Renachum Hammadi Omer, Hashevet, that's this type of vegetable or spice, mit aser zera v'yarak v'zirin. Whether it already produced the seed, or even at the earlier stage where it just produced the leaf, or it just produced the branches, all of those things are parts that are used of it. And therefore, each stage is an important stage in and of itself. And therefore, at all those stages, if you're obligated in the Maaser. Amrulo, nishtaka davar v'lo ne'emal. Bury what he said and don't let it be said again. To which they ask, like in all the other cases, Ha'ikar Rabbi Eliezer, the Kai Kafateba, Rabbi Eliezer holds like him. Ditnan, Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Shevet mitaseret zera v'yarak v'zirim. Rabbi Eliezer said exactly that. So why are they quieting him? His opinion. Hatam b'diginonita. No, when Rabbi Eliezer said it, he was talking about in a garden. In a garden, people don't wait for the seeds to grow. They eat it right away with just the leaves. But if you're growing it in the fields. In the fields, you're growing it specifically for the seeds, for the long term. And therefore, it's not considered Gemar Malacha in the fields until the seed grows. And that's why they disagree with Nahum Hammadi. And Rabbi Eliezer was talking about something else. After all these situations where Nahum Hammadi, who by the way came from Madai, okay, which was in Persia or near Persia, and came and taught all these halachot, and the rabbis every time kind of shut him up. So Rabbi Acha bar Menyuma says, Tabai, Gavra Rabba Atame Atrin, Komilta de Amrle Amrle Nishtakaya Dvar Velo Ne'al. said, I don't understand. He came from far away. He brought this Torah, and then people just said, we don't care about what you're saying. Like he was an important, prominent person. Amar, so I explained, there is one we hold like him. It wasn't like they just said no to everything he said. Titania. As it says, Nechuma Mediomer, and this is going to take us into tomorrow's daf. Shoel Adam Shracha B'Shomei Tefillah. People can add their own personal tefillah. Where do they do that? Where do you add your own personal issues? In the middle of Shomei Tefillah. It's a very famous halacha, right? You can add any sort of individual request that you have. Amar bar minei dahi detalia ba'ashle ravrave. So Rabbi Acha bar Menyuma says Tabai, no, that one doesn't count. That one doesn't count because then he was relying on big, strong ropes, meaning there were other rabbis who made that statement. That wasn't something he brought on his own. These other statements were things he brought on his own, and they made total disregard of them. But that one, he was actually relying on other rabbis. It wasn't because of what he said that they accepted it. They accepted that halacha because there were other rabbis to rely on in that situation. So now we're going to explain the background, and we're not even going to get to Nechuma Mediyah today, but we're going to give the other two opinions first. Titania. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Shoel Adam Shracha v'achar kach yitpalel. Rabbi Eliezer holds first, give all your personal requests, and then do the regular tefillah. Shneimar, like the Shmona Esrei. Tefillah la'ani kiyatov, lifnei Hashem yishpoch sicho. Tefillah to the poor person, kiyatov, he will wrap himself and talk about all of his problems. And then lifnei Hashem yishpoch sicho. After that, he will put his siach. What is siach? His speech. Ein sicha ela tefillah shneimar v'yitzei Yitzchak lasuach basadeh. Very famous. Yaakov went out lasuach basadeh. He went out in the evening. That's in the afternoon. That's how we know mincha was that. Yeah, Yitzchak became mincha. Anyway, that's not important for our purposes. The point is, it said lasuach. Suach is sicha, is tefillah. He did tefillah then, and therefore yishpoch sicha is the tefillah. Tefillah comes at the end of that pasuk, not at the beginning. Rabbi Yeshua says the exact opposite. Omer yitpalel v'achar kach yishal tzrachav. First daven, then ask your own personal request. Shene'emar eshpoch lefanav sichi. It says in a different pasuk, pour out your siach first, then sarati lefanav agid, and then my sorrows I will say before God. So now they're going to have to say, what does each one do with the other pasuk? Rabbi Eliezer nami aktiv eshpoch lefanav sicho, where it sounds like first you daven and not first you do the regular tefillah and then you ask your needs. To which he answers, Hachi Kamar. Eshpoch lefanai sichi. It's true it comes in the beginning of the pasuk, but it means I will put out my siach, my tefillah to God. Bizman shetzarati lefanav agid. The end of that pasuk is describing when, after I already did my own personal. That's what Rabbi Eliezer reads. Rabbi Yeshua, now what's he going to do? And we're going to do the exact same in the reverse. Haktiv tefillah lani kiyatov. What's he going to do with that? First it says, I'll say my own prayer. And he said, you say your own prayer after. So again, he's going to say, Hachi Kamar, Matai tefillah lani, when do we give our own personal bakasha, request? Bizman shelifnei Hashem yishpoch sicho, at the time that I've already said tefillah. So now, Mirte cry lo kamar v'lo kamar daike v'lo kamar daike. Now, you can read each pasuk in both ways. So psukim really don't show the source for each opinion, because the fact that he explained one is first, right, A, B, and then the other one is B, A, right? So like that the first part of the pasuk comes second, so they could do the same with the other pasuk. This is totally random, or arbitrary. What's really the root of the machloket? This is the root of the machloket, and we're only going to start to see it today. Kedidarish Rabbi Simlai. They actually disagree about this drasha of Rabbi Simlai. Didarish Rabbi Simlai. This is very famous. Well, I learned this when I was a kid. I assume you did as well. If not, now you're learning it. La'olam yisader adam shivcho shel makom v'achar kach yitpalel. Should always first praise God and then ask for your request, then daven. Minal ami Moshe Rabbeinu dichtiv Hashem Elokim atah chilot alarot et avdecha. Moshe says to God in Parshat Va'etchanan, God, you started to show, and you showed us all, you showed me, right, all the great things you did, and basically Moshe's praising God. And then Ukti Batre, he says, Ebran aver et haaretz hatova. And then he says, and I want to go into Eretz Israel. So first he praises God, then he asks his request. So that, now we're going to continue this and say, basically, Rabbi Yeshua is going to say, we learn from Moshe. First, right, do the praise of God, the tefillah, and then ask for your request. And then we're going to have to figure out what Rabbi Eliezer holds by and why he thinks it should be the reverse. And then eventually we're going to have to get to this other position, which is in the middle of your tefillah, and Shema tefillah is where you say. So we're going to hold off till we get there, and that's the Humamedi's position. But that's the one where we actually hold like him because he was referring to greater rabbis than him who actually said it from the beginning. So we did in the second part of today's daf, we saw this machlokes Rabbi Shmuel and the rabbis. We had to figure out the rabbis sound exactly like Tanakama, the four ways that they're different. We also got to the thing about Rabbi Shmuel that for the Christians, there was no time ever to do business according to him because 3 days before, 3 days after, and the holiday covers your whole week because every Sunday was a holiday for them. And then we got into Nahum Hamadi and other statements of Nahum Hamadi, since the fourth option of the debate between rabbis and Tanakama was perhaps whether they agree with Nahum Hamadi or not, and who said it was only one day. And from there, we got into all these slew of statements of Nahum Hamadi that were completely rejected by the rabbis, other than this last one. And we'll get back to that tomorrow. Wishing everyone a good day.